Good evening, everybody. It's 6 o'clock and I've got an echo. Could we have apologies for absence, please?
Yes, Chair. Apologies from Councillor Skeppelhorn, and he's been substituted by Councillor Underwood.
Thank you very much. Minutes for the two meetings on the 27th and the 1st February. Take those as correct. Has anybody got any corrections? I assume then I'm allowed to sign them. Thank you very much. Disclosure of interests.
On that, be made aware of, Chair.
Thank you very much.
Except your circle item.
Yes, except for me. Section 106 that we don't.
Again, non-Chair.
Okay, urgent business.
Non-Chair.
References from other committees.
Again, non-Chair.
And that brings us to reports, and the first one is finance update.
Hi, good evening, members. So, Chair, if that's okay, I will take report 8 and 9 because the budget monitoring Q3 is part of the finance update. So, if that's okay with you, Chair, I can take both. Yeah, okay. Just scrolling through. Okay, so what members you have in front of you is the Q3 report. So that's the quarter 3, which is for the period 9 months ending 31st of December. This is a forecast, what we forecast the outturn to be for the year ended 31st of March 2022. The report is going to executive, so you will see the appendix is dated 7th of March. So this is an executive report, but as we've agreed that if it's already being dispatched, we'll bring it to FRG for scrutiny, the sooner the better. So that's why, members, you've got in front of you the FRG report, which is on page 9.1, and it says the purpose is to notify the latest forecast, and the recommendation is for FRG to review and to ask any questions and to make any recommendations, which will go to the executive on the 7th of March. It's quite a very detailed report, so I will take you paragraph by paragraph. But to start with, on page 10, you will see the forecast for the year, i.e. 2021. Recommendation 1 says we will have a surplus of nearly £500,000. So that's the latest based on the information we have, and we're working on the outturn, and the outturn, once we've done, is end of March, then the outturn we'll be bringing to executive in around May time. So I'll take you through some of the main areas in the report and the main issues or concerns or conclusion from that report, and then I will be quite happy to take any questions. So paragraph 2 is important to say, as we discuss the budget 22-23, it's quite extremely challenging. Why? Because we had an emergency budget, we had coronavirus pandemic, we've got a big saving delivery plan, we've got still pressures coming from pandemic and outside pandemic due to demographic changes and due to statutory services as well, which is very much demand-led. So it's a bit like all these issues make it quite challenging, and it's very difficult to predict or to forecast, but you always run scenario, because right now it's what will happen, what won't happen. So this is based on our latest forecast which we have. But it's important to note that, and I'll take you through in future further paragraph below, is delivery of savings. So there has been a challenge because there has been lockdown, so there has been a delay in delivering some of the savings, and that was covered in last when the budget 22-23 was approved. But I will take you through some of those challenges and how this has been reprofiled in future years' budget. The paragraph 3 is just a high-level summary. So you will see the forecast general fund. So I will take you later on schools and HRA. But the general fund, you will see total services, which is on the third column, which says variation from Q3. So this is a forecast in terms of services. There is a forecast overspend of 6.1, but the other positive, i.e. upside to the budget, which is we are using some of the COVID-19 grant in the region of 2.5 million, and there is a net reduction in borrowing costs. So there has been a good in terms of the way we manage the treasury, and we try to borrow some on the short term, but still taking into account the risk. But we've locked most, if not all, our borrowing in long term now. So we've shielded ourselves against future increase in interest rate. But there has been a net reduction in borrowing costs of 4 million. And you take into account then the forecast is for the year to end up on a surplus of 500,000. Quite happy to take any other areas which you would like to cover, but it's a quite lengthy report, so I will go through certain key elements of that report. I think on page 9, you will see on Appendix A, which is A, which says what are the main components of the cross pressures. So they'll give you a breakdown where those pressures are coming from. So they sort of savings delivery, which we've discussed in 22-23 budget, which has been profiled over the next 2 years. So we used to include those savings and put contingency against those. If there is a delay, then we've got a contingency, which we used to call it a transition contingency until we deliver the ongoing savings. So those are the things now we will see, we'll discuss about next in 22-23 budget. We remove contingencies because we would say it's got to be delivered, and there's no contingency against those delivery. Towards pointing out on the same page, 9/4, the paragraph B, where it says the savings program over the last 3 years, which is 19-20 to 21-22, amounts to nearly 39 million. Out of these, 72% have been delivered, and there was 10 million, and these are the things which we are concentrating to deliver in the next 2 years. So it was noting that since we had the pandemic, the council has delivered 72% of that 38 million. So it's a program which was set up as part of the emergency budget, partly to deliver those savings, but those always sort of there is a time lag in delivering some of those savings. On the next page, it's worth looking at the impact on 22-23 budget. So, and it lays out how those 10 million, which is being reassessed, and the 4 bullet points describes how we are going to reprofile it, and some of them will be delivered as part of the realigned transformation program of 1.7 million. So that gives you a bit what is the report and what impact it's having on the 22-23 budget, which was approved by full council. It was pointing out on paragraph 5, the 21-22 coronavirus impact. So we have 4.8 million of income, including income losses resulting from pandemic, which is funded from additional funding from central government of 6.7 million. Now, what is important to note, some of those pressures will still be with us for 22-23 and possibly 23-24, and mainly things like income where they will recover the pre-pandemic level of income of like parking. So it was noting in the budget, we've made allowance for any additional pressure which will carry on, because the grant from central government we won't be getting significant grant like to cover fees and charges. The other point, which is then paragraph 6, which goes onwards, and that gives a detailed explanation of where the core budget pressures, which is non-coronavirus, because coronavirus we monitor separately, it's based on the pressures, but the core budget, and it takes you from paragraph 6. So see in the chief exec department, the main one, so I won't go into every line, but the main one we've got, there's an overspend on revenues and benefits. This is like shortfall of income, things like summons or the recovery, which we charge, but the court has been closed. Now they are reopened. So if you can't take summons, we can't charge for those fees. Paragraph B, children's services. So children's services, there is a slight underspend, but you have to take this into the round that over the years, there has been significant growth into children and families education services. So at least based on the latest forecast, that budget looks like it has been more or less stabilized because of the significant investment in that area. The next one, which is on page 9.7, which is inclusive economy. So inclusive economy is an area where there is a quite significant net overspend. And the paragraph below explains the ICT. there is an overspend of 1.6 because there's a certain element of savings which is unachieved. And this is due to CCN. CCN is contract change notice on the ICT budget. Previously, these were funded from reserves and there was some ICT credit we are getting back from Civica. Now those reserves and credit has run out, so these are the overspend. And a significant amount of this overspend is already built in next year's budget. So when you will see the impact on 22-23 budget, quite a lot of these variations have been taken into account when setting the 22-23 budget. So, and that gives you can look at those areas. So property and infrastructure, there's commercial properties, and this is one of the areas which we've discussed in Q2 and Q1 before is the amount of annual cost for preservation house. There's overspend on facilities management as well. And there's other paragraph, which is third bullet point, Roman letter 3, is on highways repairs and maintenance. So still highways repairs and maintenance, all these have been built into 22-23 budget. So there has been an additional capital program as well, you will see in highways, just to take into account those budget pressures, which has been reported in Q3. So we use Q3 quite detailed in order to prepare the following year budget. And then the next page is about sustainable development. So that is waste disposal costs. And this as well we have been mentioning due to the coronavirus, there's people who are working from home. So there has been an increase in recycling. And then at the same time, there has been a reduction in the price at which we can sell those recycling. So that as well, there has been a growth in the 22-23 budget. So quite a lot of these areas we factored in the 22-23 budget. Population well-being, there's net underspend, and the main reason for that net underspend in population well-being is overall they have delivered quite a lot of those savings, and those savings were releasing the contingency. So those savings are cashable now. So adult social care, slight sort of underspend. So here as well, which I would say, if you look at adult social care with the precepts, so council have been increasing the precept in line with government staff instruction, and those precepts have gone into adult social care. So there has been investment in adult social care as well. So two areas which are frontline, children's services and adult social care, there has been investment there. So at least those budgets looks more or less stable, but they are very much demand led. Yeah. So at least we've got, the council has invested. I think page 9/10 on top is important. So you will see the point which I've made earlier. If you see the total savings program, 19-20, 15 million, 2021, 17 million, 21-22, 6 million. So in the last 3 years, there has been significant savings program being delivered by the council in total of nearly 39 million. Out of 39 million delivered, nearly 30 million. So that's what I've mentioned earlier, is the 72% is delivered. Now, officers, members, everybody is working towards delivering the rest, which we've profiled it to be a bit more realistic, because previously we are profiling the whole thing in year 1 and putting contingency. What we've done now, we remove contingency and rather reprofile it over 2 years, which is much more sort of realistic. I think the next paragraph talks about the contingency has been removed in 22-23, and it has been rather than reprofiling 22-23 and 23-24. So we just put the savings a more realistic target. I think on page 9, there is a paragraph on employee pay award. That was not settled, but we have received sort of confirmation that the pay award for 21-22 will be settled at 1.75%. So that's the forecast we have been using in in the forecast. So that has been settled now. So what we have been using 1.75, lately it has been agreed to be 1.75. So I don't expect any variation on pay awards. And then the corporate level budget, which is G, it talks about the main element is the increase net reduction in our borrowing costs. And that's general fund. So page 9/11, that talks about other funds. So public health, which has got a budget of 15.5, and there's a net underspend of 0.4. So anything is in public health budget that is not going to be mixed with general fund, so that gets carried forward in the following year's budget. Housing revenue account, same is we've got a surplus, and that surplus will go towards funding the future capital program for HRA. And then in schools budget, there's a net underspend of 1.7. So it's the same way it will be carried forward against the schools reserves for the following year. I think paragraph 8 talk about coronavirus funding. So as I've said, it was 7 million, and the 4 bullet points just explain how those have been applied. And we talk a little bit more about the ring fencing of grant funding from coronavirus. So this is on top of the 6.9. There's other funding from central government, like infection prevention control, COVID winter grant, and these are the disbursement which we have been dispersing in accordance to the conditions attached with those grants. But there has been a lot of work being done by the council, not only the coronavirus main grant, but there's additional grant which government has provided, like contained outbreak management fund, 1.7 million. So those are the figures. Some of those grants will be carried forward in 22-23, and this is based on the grant conditions. So that's based on the revenue budget. Then capital budget is the total budget was 131 million, made up of 106, which is on page 913, paragraph 10, and the general fund budget of 24.7 million. Out of this, the forecast is the spend will be around 160. So there's underspend of 15, and that's mainly because some of the project has been reprofiled, and these will be spent in the following years, i.e. 22-23. My system, yeah, it's yeah, just give me 1 sec. For some reason, it's not responding, so yeah, just bear with me. No, it's not. Okay, so what I will say here, I can't move the page for some reason, but these are the major variations, and you will see there are some highways project, there are some IT projects, and this is mainly because of the pandemic. There has been delay because there has been resources shifted to other areas. Okay. So my apologies, my system is just not responding. Yeah, that's very kind of you, Councillor. It's always good fallback position, paper, can't get away from paper. So the final thing which I would say here is on your page 915, what are the key risks? Because the key risks of the budget, especially when Councillor Malcolm presented the budget at full council, there is still risk. There's still coronavirus, still recovery economy. There's still a lot of demand-led pressures. So those are the risks always we have to bear in mind. And that's bringing us to the end of the report. And the detailed appendices which talks about the savings, which one has been delivered, which one has been reprofiled. So that brings us to the end of the report. So I'm quite happy to take any questions, Chair. Just keep this for him. Yeah.
Councillor, you say?
Yep. Can I just ask you, in terms of the, and this in your report, in terms of the Afghan refugee children or in the Afghan families, is that fully funded by the Home Office? Is that national funding? There is no local contribution to that Afghan refugees.
Yes, thanks, Councillor. So far, yes, it's funded. So the spend, which we're keeping track of all those spend, which is directly linked with the funding for Afghan refugees. And there has been allocation per case for schools, placement and everything. So we have made claim Home Office against those spend. To my knowledge, I don't think, I will go back and double check, but these are funding which is Home Office has wrote to us. And we've made our claim and hopefully we'll get those refunded. But I will get back if there's anything which the council, yeah, I'll do. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, to my knowledge, yes.
A small overspend because the need is far greater than, you know, in terms of that. Is that funded by the, you know, the government has announced they are send an extra money. But does that cover that increase in demand for the special educational needs transport?
Demand is still something which, as I said, is some of the areas with demand led. We'll go back and check the exact figures, but the overspending the special educational need is not covered by the additional funding from central government. It's still, yeah. So what council is doing, we are looking at all those areas where demand is coming. Some of them are very complex cases. And council is looking at those areas because there has been a significant increase in sort of transport and for a special educational need. The transport area, it has been a significant increase. So maybe because of the pandemic, but some of them, if we are getting out of the pandemic, if there is scope for there to bring those spend within budget, or if there is an additional requirement for the budget. But those are the things which, as I've mentioned, is part of the risk in the budget. So not all the spend from central government, the funding will cover all the special educational need stuff transport.
In terms of the housing, the homelessness because of the pandemic, as well as in terms of the cost in energy costs, there would be a pressure on that because more families are likely to be becoming homeless. So there is an overspend already. So the council has got to use. Is the government promising anything at all in terms of homelessness at all?
I think local government overall, there's pressure, homelessness, there's pressure in social care, there's pressure in children's services. So there is pressure everywhere. I think in terms of local government, there is representation going to central government to say social care, if you take, for instance, social care, it's got to be properly funded. So having precept is a way, but the long-term solution is to properly fund. And the same thing applies for homelessness as well. Yeah, there's a big increase in the number of homelessness. And coming back when you said if the energy cost goes up, residents will have to start to look at the budget, the rent payment, the energy cost. So we'll have to monitor. And one of the things is, as Councillor Shaw mentioned, in full council, the council decided to put the rent for HRA social by below what was recommended by the government. And that's to help. And what we'll be looking at and monitoring, if there's other areas where there's an increase in homelessness, we'll have to keep a close eye. And those are the demand-led. Hopefully, central government might come up with more grant, but we'll have to wait and see. But these are the things, the big areas, as I said, social care, housing, those are the things very much demand-led. So we'll be working with our housing department. There is a report, I think, Colin will be bringing. I think it's, looking at things like deposit, looking at rent, looking at how we are going to manage. And there's other things which the council is working on, how the council will be looking at how we can have a bigger role in the market. So housing is absolutely top of the priority, same like social care. Those are, thanks.
In terms of, particularly in terms of the housing, the council has a statutory duty towards the children. So whichever way one thinks, it may be that when they become homeless, council still has to fund the families a housing because that's their statutory duty, isn't it? Yeah. So I think unless the government comes with some sort of rescue of those families that are not refusing to pay, but haven't got the money to pay for it. It's between the food or the rent. And I think in the private sector, I wasn't talking about the council housing. I was talking about private sector. Rent, when they start going up, will be very much an impact in Luton because Luton is impacted far worse in terms of the COVID-19 than any other parts of the country. So we need to be keeping that in mind.
Absolutely, I would sort of disagree with you. That's exactly, and we are trying to look the housing, the implication and impact on housing has on social care, on children, on schools. So officers are looking, it cut across everything. So housing is absolutely a top priority. And I think you will see in the budget, there's provision for the temporary accommodation purchase too. So the council is investing more, trying to buy more properties for larger families. And officers is working on the next step on where do we go from TAPS 2, if there's a TAPS 2 or TAPS 3 or TAPS 3 plus. So the council is seriously looking at making sure that there's a decent, good quality housing. And HRA, the investment in HRA showed that the council is willing to invest in our housing stock. But we will be coming with report to say how much more we can use the council sort of leverage we have to invest in the housing market. Thank you.
And David?
Yeah, mine actually, excuse me, mine are actually comments. The chair, if you want to take questions first, or do you want me to carry on?
Looking at page 9/5, in section 5, which obviously coronavirus impacts, it obviously says 4.853 million of direct cost impacts and impact losses are resulting from the pandemic reported. How is it decided what are direct impacts from the pandemic and what have just happened in that period and might have been things that happened if there hadn't been a pandemic in that same period?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good question. And to be honest, how we manage those, we had to get an additional resource just to track. So, and we have been making monthly return to Bs, to MHCLG with detail. There has been a process where when somebody in the council make a bid for here's a pandemic, here's the coronavirus related, there's a process that goes through finance. We look at it, we look at the business case. Why? Is it pandemic related, not pandemic related? So there has been a very, very detailed review, monitoring, reporting process because you have to test the test for the auditors when they come around. So there's Mike Chow. Mike Chow, he has been keeping absolutely. And every week we have been discussing, and there's a board, which is a sort of coronavirus board, which was looking at that, made of service directors. And so there was quite a good screening and governance process to identify what is a pandemic related, what is not pandemic related. And in terms of sales fees and charges, we do send those return and central government in terms of MHCLG, now it's Deluxe, they will look at it. And if we are an outlier, then they will ask for the question. But so far they have accepted our return and we had refund on the fees and charges. So yeah, it has been, sometimes department will come with some proposal and we say, hang on, but it doesn't fit within the criteria. So we try. So there was a rigorous process of approval. What is pandemic, what is not pandemic before we release the budget and the funds. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think the first thing I need to say is that I'm really, really happy to see the statement that the use of contingencies is not being carried forward into the 22-23 budget. And that was made clear by Councillor Malcolm when he presented the budget. But I'm pleased about that because contingencies have, for some years now, disguised the true position. If you look at, for example, paragraph 3 on page 9/3, the net forecast underspend of 1.1 million isn't in fact an underspend of 1.1 million. If you take in the 3.2 million contingencies that have been brought into the equation, it is in fact a 2.7 million overspend, which is disguised by the use of the contingencies. So it's good to see that that is not going to continue. Paragraph B on page 9/4 just reminds us that there are still more than £10.5 million worth of savings scheduled for the last 3 financial years, which have still not been realised. I appreciate that work is still going on to fill that gap, and it's a gap that obviously does need to be filled. Moving on to the middle of page 9/7, commercial properties, an almost 1.2 million overspend, due mainly to the annual costs for Preservation House, which the council has acquired the leasehold interest, but not the freehold. I don't suppose Deb Gopal is interested at all in telling us what the annual rent the council is paying for that, but it does seem that they're taking rather a long time to make up their minds whether they should buy the freehold to save the rent. Clearly, the relationship between the annual rent and the likely cost of the freehold is one of the considerations that will need to be taken into consideration. I think there are just 2 more points I'd like to make. The next one is a request, please. Could Dev, I'm looking at the 3 bullet points at the top of page 9.8, and the last one of those, which shows a 0.2 million overspend on parks and open spaces, which specifically refers to traveller remediation works. I wonder if Deb could please drop me an email to let me know the 2 figures. First of all, what was the budget for the current year for traveller remediation works? And what is the current forecast spend on traveller remediation works? I'd just like to separate that figure from other expenditure on parks and green open spaces. And the last thing I want to say is there's been a good and quite interesting discussion on homelessness. There are 2 things we need to note about homelessness. Number one is, yes, there was a very significant spike in the costs of dealing with homelessness during the first and second lockdown periods during the pandemic. Most of that, in fact, I think nearly all of it, was covered by government grant. So that's something we should be thankful for. There isn't a great deal that we should be thankful for from this government, but that at least is something. And the final thing to say about homelessness is it's a budget that has been overspent for some years. And I personally think we should note and thank the housing team for the 2 things that they've done over those years. Number one, they've made significant innovative ways to reduce the cost, whilst at the same time making sure that the service was still there for those who needed it. And that's something that we ought to be saying thank you to them for. Thank you, Chair.
Yes.
Would you like to reply or say anything?
Yeah, I will respond to a couple of those. But thanks very much. That's Councillor Frank, and I'm sure Colin is here, so I'm sure we all officers appreciate the work he's doing on homelessness, and absolutely right, we are trying to bring this under control. But it's a challenge. It's demand-led. In terms of the savings, yeah, the point you made is there is 10 million which we have to deliver. But when you put into context, we are talking about 38 million of savings. We've delivered 30 million, 28 to 30 million. So that we'll have to put it in context, and driving a big savings program during a pandemic when you've got demand pressures, still delivering 72% of that savings. It is a challenge, and I would say by and large, officers, council, WIS members have done what we wish we would have delivered the whole thing, but still there are pressures which we have. In terms of the contingency, Councillor Frank, I think we had several exchanges. I would say disguise, because if the figure was not there how we are using the contingent, then I would say if I just put a net figure without being open and transparent how contingency is being used, then I would be quite happy to say, oh, I'm just not clean. But it's there. It's just the point I fully agree with you. Is it gross or net? That's probably you're trying to say. If we take net, but if you add the contingent, but the gross is higher, absolutely. And that's why it's very detailed to say, yes, we are explaining how we are using contingency. Yes, so in terms of the request, I will take it back and I will come back with you by email, the budget, the current focus and the spend. And thanks so much for those comment on homelessness. We wish we can keep quite other areas of the budget, but some of the budget like social care, we are trying to get a firm control of those budget. But thank you very much. Thanks.
Any other comments? Councillor Hussain?
Can I just comment in terms of the savings, because I think one of the things that we do, and Dev has already covered that, you know, the 78 million that already, and in terms of the demand, which is but the question I asked earlier on from Dev, was that in terms of the special needs, in the homelessness, there has been a huge increase. 40% of special need has gone up. And that, even though if you had contingency budget there, it still did not cover that. And that is really one of the biggest pressure for this council. And in terms of the homelessness, they have done a fantastic job to bring that down, but there is still a pressure likely to be in the future unless the government decides, you know, to help the local authorities. And in terms of the overall budget, there's £1.6 billion shortage in children's services in social care side of it, national, which every local authority up and down the country is lobbying the government, and so is the LGA. So I think we have got a huge pressures in these budgets, and overall, I think in I think we need to thank all the Dev and his team and all the individuals in the council. Despite all the difficulties, they've done a fantastic job and they have kept the services, and the council has continued to provide services to the most vulnerable people. So thank you very much to the staff who work so hard, and many of them sometimes risking their own lives. Thank you.
I'll just say thanks very much for the kind word, and I'm sure officers would really appreciate. And it has been tough, but members, residents, everybody has been working together, and it has been difficult. Over the last 2 years, it has been really, really difficult.
Nothing else? I just wish to thank Dev for a very succinct third quarter report for this financial year. Thank you very much. Item 10, the rent deposit scheme. Oh.
Hi, Chair. Colin Moon, Service Director for Housing. I've got on the screen Shushma Chauhan, who's one of the managers in Homelessness or Housing Solutions, as we call them, and also I've got Fozia Durrani here, who's also another manager in Homelessness, and will help me out with some detailed questions if I get any. So, Chair, I'm just going to present the report. I don't have your papers, I've got my own paper, so I'll just refer to the numbers of the sections. This is about rent deposits. It's not a whole homelessness picture, so I'm not going to go into the homeless picture. I will touch on it, and I know there were some questions earlier, and we'll touch on homelessness. But generally speaking, the rent deposit scheme is used mainly as a homeless prevention tool. So when homeless households come to us presenting themselves as homeless or potentially homeless, we have the means to offer them a deposit, rent in advance, so that they can access the private rented sector, so that they don't end up in temporary accommodation. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. So on your first page of the report under item 3, it just tells you what the figures are. Usually it's about £1,000 to £2,000 for each deposit. Now the deposit's a loan, it's not a grant, so we loan this to households and they have to pay us back. So this is one part of our tools to deal with homelessness. If you just look at the table under 4, it says year 1 temporary accommodation reduction. The reason why I put it in here is just to give you a little bit of context around homelessness and how rent deposits play its part in managing homelessness. If you look at the, this is the January actuals, well, the first figure, 1139, is actually December actuals. So at that time we had 1,139 households in temporary accommodation. And you can see the next line, 3201. So to the end of January, from April, we had 3,201 homeless households. That they could be single people or families, 2, 3, 4, 5 bed families coming to the council. Now 3,201, it's a huge amount. And January and February figures just came in. We had 423 households approach the council as homeless. That's just massive for an area like Luton, and that's relentless. The February figure was the second highest figure across the whole year. We had 477 in 1 month this year. So we are basically getting quite a lot of people approaching us as homeless, and it's a massive figure. But part of our job is to prevent homelessness, and we call it relief. So if we don't prevent someone from being homeless within 56 days, they go into another phase of our homeless legislation, which is called relief. And they may be in temporary accommodation at that time, but we can still prevent them from getting to the other end. And if we can't relieve them, they'll be in temporary accommodation for a long time. When I first got here in April, did some stats, we had 49 households who've been in temporary accommodation for over 9 years. And at that point in April, there was 1,220 homeless households in temporary accommodation. As at the end of January, if you go over the page, or my page anyway, we had 1,108 households in temporary accommodation. So we've reduced that number, I won't say significantly, but by 100. So the rent deposit scheme is important because it helps us to prevent homelessness. Under 7 of my report, it says that we've spent to date £73,000 on rent deposits, and we've helped 54 households. Under 8, you can see a daunting figure which says people owe us 600k, roughly around 600k. But this dates back from 2015. We do try to collect the money, so it's a loan. We set up a payment plan for households. They're in the private sector, renting their property still, and they've got to pay us back, and some of them don't. So there are quite a lot of cases with our legal team to take action against these households. But the good thing is that actually of those households who we've given rent deposits to, only about 4 or 5 have made their way into temporary accommodation. So it actually does work. And you have to remember that this is just like the normal private sector. People go to an estate agent to look for a property to rent, and they will find a rent deposit, rent in advance from their own pockets. It's just that the council helps out those households who, generally speaking, can't afford a rent deposit, basically. Just some challenges, Chair, under item 11.2. It's a loan and it has to be paid back. So some of these households are on benefits, and some of them find it difficult to pay back these loans, and therefore they get into difficulties. And I have mentioned under the second bullet, this is about poverty. There are some people who come to us, they're homeless. I'm not saying all homeless households are in poverty or are vulnerable to that point. Some people are made homeless, some households are made homeless through all sorts of reasons, not because they haven't got a lot of money. Some people just lose their property because in the private sector, after 3 years, the landlord may want their property back and they evict them. And you can't do anything about it. So not because they're vulnerable. So there are issues, but there are some people who are generally vulnerable and haven't got a lot of money and do struggle to pay. In some cases, we have found that the loan has been a deterrent for people. So they don't take the loan up, they can't afford it, and suddenly they become homeless at the end of it. We can't compel them to take the loan. Most people do, but some people don't. And as a result, they end up homeless. And obviously in this current economic climate, it is becoming more difficult for people to pay things back because they got all sorts of other issues around, like fuel, and as we mentioned this earlier, food. So it's an issue, and the 600 debt is a problem for us. I mean, in housing alone, I don't want to shock any of you members today, but we carry about 13 million worth of debt. That's not only council tenant debt, but that's also households who are in temporary accommodation. 8.8 million of that debt is temporary accommodation, but former arrears where people have moved on to other places. So it is an issue for us generally. So just to summarise, Chair, it is a part of the process to prevent homelessness. It does an effective job, but it's not the whole picture. But it's one of our tools we use to manage homelessness and manage people to go into the private sector. And Chair, I will take any questions you have.
Any questions? Any questions at all? In that case, David, you have comments.
Yeah, just a couple of points I think are worth making. Thank you, Chair. I mean, the first thing to say, I guess, is I'm probably the only councillor who has actually been made homeless by the council. Admittedly, it was a very long time ago, and certainly before the Housing Homeless Persons Act came in, which gave the council responsibility for rehousing homeless families. I recall very clearly when this deposit loan scheme was first introduced, 5, 6, 7 years ago, it was quite clear to everybody involved that it seemed very reasonable, and I think it still is reasonable, to expect those who can afford it to repay the loan because it can recycle the money and make the money available for further loans. But it was also accepted that there were going to be significant numbers of people who were not going to be able to repay, and the money was simply going to have to be written off. The service was there because it was required, because it was needed, because it was reducing the homeless problems, and yeah, there was going to be a cost because not everyone was going to be able to repay the loan. I don't think anybody really argued about that. It was generally agreed that that's where we were. It would be helpful, I think, if Colin could just let us know if he hasn't got the figures with him this evening, then an email would be helpful. The £600,000, which is the overall debt, it would be useful to get some clue about what proportion that is of the amount that has been issued in loans over the 6 or 7 years since the scheme was introduced. Just for information, no more. I guess the majority of it is in the hands of people who can't afford to repay it. And after all, that's what the scheme was put up there for in the first place. But some idea of the proportion of over the whole period would be, I think, helpful. Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, I didn't see you, Councillor, you saying for questions, so can we ask the questions now,
yeah,
please?
I was trying to get a question because this is something I'm not too sure is in the report or not, but does that, that covers in people that are, for one reason or the other, are sentenced to a few months of going to prison, and then they come out and they've lost the house, and does that cover them too? Because they, already, for one reason or the other, my experience sitting in the bench in the court was that there were a number of people who went in for a short sentence, and when they come back, they lost the house, and they were homeless, and they were going back into the revolving door back to prison again. So does that cover them? Will the council help them, or I didn't see? It's probably not in the report, and not probably when the passage is relevant to that. But can you answer that?
Yeah,
please?
thanks, councillor. I mean, anyone who's homeless can approach us, and we have to carry out an assessment to check whether or not they're homeless, and if they've just come out of prison, usually they're going to be homeless, but we have to check if they have got any vulnerabilities, if they've got a priority need. So there's a raft of things that we have to go through. Just because you come out of prison doesn't mean that we'll accept you for housing. We've got quite a lot of hostel provision across the borough and in Bedford. So generally speaking, we can place people in our hostel. We've got probably around 800 plus hostel rooms available across the homeless partnership in Luton. So usually, if you come out of prison and you're homeless, there will be some provision for you. And obviously, we'll accept you as homeless if you've got a priority need and you've got vulnerability. But just because you've come out of prison doesn't mean there's an automatic right to be accepted as homeless.
Thank you. Anybody else got any questions? Well, thank you, Colin, for a very interesting report. It was quite an eye-opener of some of the things that you have to do with the 3 case studies that you produced. One can see the tremendous problems you have, whether to prosecute or not, and whether it's worth it in the end. But anyway, thank you very much for coming along and giving a very good report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Members have before them the work programme for the remainder of the year, which the next meeting is the 14th of April. The next meeting, once the dates for 2022-23 have been finalised, the work programme will obviously increase. But it's members' opportunity if there's anything on the horizon on the forward plan that they want to get added to the work programme. Yeah.
Any questions, requests? In that case, sorry.
Because we're still in the financial year of 2021-22 for municipal. So that isn't, yeah, that's correct. It's 21-22 that we're currently in.
No other requests? Thank you very much. So item 12, which is the Local Government Act of 72, we now go into private session. I presume that's I have the agreement